When German soldiers looked out from the heights of Vimy Ridge in April 1917, they believed they were holding one of the strongest defensive positions on the entire Western Front. The ridge gave them a commanding view over the WWI plain. They had fortified it for years with deep trenches, reinforced concrete bunkers, layers of barbed wire, and carefully positioned machine gun nests. Previous Allied assaults had ended in disaster, with massive casualties and little to show for it. From the German perspective, Vimy Ridge was practically untouchable. So when the Canadian Corps prepared to attack, few on either side expected anything different from the usual pattern of World War I offensives. Days of bombardment, a whistle blast, waves of infantry climbing out of trenches, and then chaos. That had been the grim rhythm of the war. But what unfolded on April 9, 1917, was something else entirely. In the weeks leading up to the assault, the Canadians did something that was still relatively new in modern warfare. They planned obsessively. Every soldier, down to the lowest private, was given detailed briefings about the terrain, the objectives, and the timing. They built full-scale replicas of the battlefield behind the lines and rehearsed the attack. Repeatedly. Men memorized their routes across no man's land. They studied trench layouts and bunker positions. They practiced what to do if their officers were killed. Initiative wasn't just encouraged. It was expected. For German defenders used to facing rigid command structures where disruption could stall an attack, this was a dangerous innovation. If a Canadian officer fell, another soldier stepped up instantly. Units kept moving. Momentum never stalled. Then there was the artillery. For weeks before the attack, Canadian and British guns pounded the German lines. But this wasn't random shelling. It was systematic. Counter-battery fire targeted German artillery positions with remarkable accuracy. Supply routes were disrupted. Barbed wire was shredded. Communication lines were cut. German troops huddled in deep dugouts as the earth shook above them, unsure of when or where the blow would land. And then came the creeping barrage. The element that truly stunned many defenders. At 0 hour, as snow and sleet swept across the battlefield, artillery shells began landing in a precise line just ahead of the advancing infantry. Every few minutes, that curtain of explosions moved forward by a set distance. The Canadian soldiers advanced directly behind it, sometimes only 100 yards from the falling shells. It required discipline and timing. Move too slowly, and you'd be left exposed to enemy fire. Move too quickly, and you risked being hit by your own artillery. But they had rehearsed it over and over again. To the German troops emerging from their shelters, disoriented and cut off from clear communication, the experience was overwhelming. As soon as the barrage lifted from a trench line, Canadian soldiers were already there. Rifles ready, bayonets fixed, moving in coordinated waves. There was no long pause between bombardment and infantry assault like in previous battles. There was no time to reorganize or man defensive positions properly. It felt relentless. Another crucial difference was how the Canadians structured their objectives. Instead of pushing recklessly toward a distant final goal, they broke the assault into clearly defined stages. Each unit had a specific line to capture and consolidate before the next wave moved through to leapfrog ahead. This bite and hold approach meant gains were secured before advancing further. It reduced confusion and prevented overextension. German defenders who were accustomed to seeing breakthroughs collapse under counterattack found themselves facing an enemy that dug in almost immediately after advancing. Machine guns were repositioned quickly. Defensive perimeters were established within minutes. The Canadians weren't just attacking. They were preparing to defend every yard they captured. Communication also played a key role. Runners, signalers, and pre-arranged visual signals helped maintain coordination despite the chaos. Even when lines were cut, junior leaders made decisions based on the overall plan they already understood. The battle didn't hinge on a single point of failure. For the Germans on Vimy Ridge, this level of coordination was deeply unsettling. They had believed the ridge's natural strength and fortifications would break any assault. Instead, they were facing an enemy that combined careful planning, flexible leadership, and precise artillery integration in a way that minimized the usual disorder of trench warfare. Within hours, key sections of the ridge had fallen. By the end of the first day, much of what had seemed impregnable was in Canadian hands. It wasn't that the fighting wasn't brutal. It absolutely was. Casualties were heavy. The snow turned to mud mixed with blood. Machine guns still tore through advancing lines. But unlike earlier Allied attacks that dissolved into confusion, this one kept its structure. It kept moving. And that's what shocked the German defenders most. They weren't witnessing another costly, disorganized offensive. They were facing a force that had learned from years of failure on the Western Front and adapted. A force where planning met execution with frightening precision. A force that didn't crumble when leaders fell or when resistance stiffened. In that moment, the Canadian Corps demonstrated that it was not merely a colonial contingent fighting under British command. It was a modern, coordinated fighting force capable of executing one of the most complex operations of the war. And for the German soldiers who had once considered Vimy Ridge unassailable, the realization was impossible to ignore. This enemy was different. But beyond the planning, beyond the artillery precision and carefully rehearsed advances, there was something else that left a deep impression on the German defenders at Vimy Ridge. The sheer aggression and determination of the Canadian troops once the fighting became close and personal. War on the Western Front was often reduced to artillery statistics and territorial gains measured in yards. But at its core, it was still fought by men face to face in trenches, dugouts, and shattered craters. And this is where reputation was forged. By 1917, the Canadian Corps had already developed a name for itself. German units had encountered them before at places like Ypres and the Somme. They knew these soldiers were not inexperienced volunteers anymore. They were hardened by years of brutal fighting. When the creeping barrage lifted and Canadians poured into the German trench systems at Vimy, the battle shifted instantly from long-range bombardment to savage, close-quarters combat. Trenches twisted in confusing angles. Dugouts ran deep underground. Visibility was limited by smoke, snow, and debris. In that environment, discipline and intensity mattered just as much as strategy. Canadian soldiers moved fast. They cleared trench segments methodically, using grenades, rifles, bayonets, and sometimes entrenching tools when ammunition ran low. Lewis gunners were brought forward quickly to provide covering fire down communication trenches. Small assault groups worked together with a kind of controlled aggression. One man covering while another advanced, then switching roles in a steady rhythm. To the German defenders, who had believed their fortified lines would slow any advance, the speed and force of these assaults were jarring. There was little hesitation. Even when machine gun fire cut down men in the open, the formations closed ranks and kept moving. If a section stalled, another maneuvered around it. The pressure rarely let up. Part of that determination came from experience. The Canadian Corps had learned painful lessons in earlier battles where frontal assaults without coordination led to catastrophe. By Vimy Ridge, they were no longer green troops thrown into impossible situations. They were veterans who understood the stakes and the cost of failure. Many had lost friends in previous offensives. There was a grim resolve that carried them forward. Weather conditions only amplified the challenge. On the morning of the attack, sleet and snow blew across the ridge, mixing with mud and churned earth. Equipment became heavy. Rifles jammed. Visibility dropped. But the advance did not falter. German defenders emerging from their dugouts found not a scattered enemy struggling through the storm, but organized waves pressing forward despite it. In some areas, the fighting descended into brutal hand-to-hand encounters. Dugouts had to be cleared room by room. Resistance pockets held out until grenades forced surrender or silence. Canadian soldiers were known for their effectiveness in trench raids earlier in the war. And that experience translated directly into these moments. They were accustomed to sudden, violent engagements in tight spaces. What also stood out was their refusal to give ground once it had been taken. Capturing a trench was only the first step. Almost immediately, Canadians began reversing defenses, turning German strongpoints around, setting up their own machine guns, establishing fields of fire in anticipation of counterattacks. When German reserves attempted to retake lost ground, they encountered troops who were already entrenched and prepared. That resilience contributed heavily to the shock. In previous battles, breakthroughs sometimes dissolved under counterpressure. Units would advance too far, become disorganized, and be driven back. At Vimy, that pattern didn't repeat itself. The Canadians absorbed counterattacks and held firm. They were not just aggressive in assault. They were stubborn in defense. German reports from the period often described certain Allied units as particularly formidable. And the Canadians increasingly fell into that category. They were viewed as effective shock troops. Adaptable, physically tough, and mentally hardened. The reputation wasn't built on myth alone. It was earned in these grinding confrontations where hesitation meant death. Within 4 days, the Ridge, a position that French and British forces had failed to secure in earlier attempts, was fully in Canadian hands. The cost was high. Thousands were killed or wounded. Entire communities back home would feel the loss. But from a military perspective, the achievement was undeniable. For German soldiers who survived the battle, the impression lingered. They had faced an enemy that combined meticulous planning with relentless execution. An enemy that did not collapse when conditions worsened. An enemy that fought with intensity from the first artillery shell to the last trench cleared. And this is where the deeper significance emerges. Vimy Ridge was not just a tactical victory. It marked a psychological shift. Canada was no longer seen merely as a supporting force within the British Empire. On that ridge, through discipline and sheer determination, its soldiers carved out an identity of their own. The shock wasn't just about losing ground. It was about confronting a corps that had evolved into one of the most capable assault formations. On the Western Front, the Germans recognized it. Allied commanders recognized it. And Canadians themselves began to recognize it. When the guns finally quieted and the snow settled over the captured ridge, the battlefield told the story. Fortifications that had once seemed impregnable were now occupied by new defenders. The cost had been immense, but so was the statement made. At Vimy Ridge, the world, and especially Germany, saw that Canada's soldiers were not only organized and precise. They were fierce, relentless, and unyielding when it mattered most.